In the rocky, sun-baked landscapes of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northwestern India, a small reptile has survived for millions of years. Perfectly adapted to extreme heat, scarce resources, and rugged terrain, the leopard gecko has endured through ice ages, shifting continents, and the slow crawl of geological time. Today, that same animal lives in homes across the world, kept as a companion, studied as a species, and unfortunately, far too often misunderstood. This is the story of one leopard gecko, a single animal pulled from inadequate conditions and given something it had likely never experienced before, an environment built to match exactly who it is. 1. The rescue. It began with a message. A neighbor, facing a cross-country move with no room for her pets, was looking for someone willing to take in her leopard gecko. The offer arrived quietly, no urgency, no drama, just a simple question. Was there anyone willing to give this animal a home? The answer was yes. When the enclosure was first examined, what was found told a story that is, regrettably, an extremely common one in the world of pet reptiles. A 10-gallon glass tank, roughly the size of a small carry-on suitcase, a single paper towel lining the bottom, one plastic hide positioned on the warm side of the enclosure, a low-wattage incandescent bulb mounted on the screen lid above, a shallow, slightly cloudy water dish pushed into the corner, and inside all of it, a leopard gecko. Pale, still, and quiet. The animal was not visibly injured. It was not bleeding or limping or showing any dramatic outward sign of distress. But experienced eyes could see what a casual observer might miss entirely. The gecko's posture was flattened. Its eyes were slightly dull. The fat reserves stored in its tail, one of the most reliable indicators of a leopard gecko's nutritional history, were noticeably depleted. This was an animal surviving at the lower boundary of its biological tolerance, not dying, but not living either. 2. Understanding the species. To understand why those conditions were problematic, it is necessary to first understand what a leopard gecko actually is and where it comes from. Eublepharus macularius, the leopard gecko, belongs to the family Eublepharidae, a group of geckos distinguished by a set of characteristics that separate them from most of their relatives. Unlike the majority of gecko species, leopard geckos have fully movable eyelids, a feature so significant that their family name translates roughly to true eyelid. They also lack the adhesive toe pads found in climbing geckos, a reflection of their entirely ground-dwelling lifestyle. In their native range, leopard geckos occupy semi-arid grasslands, rocky scrublands, and dry mountain foothills. The terrain is unforgiving: loose gravel, compacted clay, sparse vegetation, and dramatic temperature swings between day and night. Daytime surface temperatures can exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit across the exposed rock and soil. But beneath the surface, sheltered inside deep rock crevices and packed earth burrows, temperatures remain significantly cooler and more stable. Leopard geckos are crepuscular by nature, most active during the low-light hours of dusk and early dawn, when surface temperatures drop into a manageable range and the risk of predation from daytime hunters decreases. During the peak heat of midday and the coldest hours before sunrise, they retreat underground, pressing their bodies against thermally stable rock and soil. This behavioral biology is not incidental. It is the foundation upon which every aspect of leopard gecko care must be built. An animal that evolved to move between temperature extremes, seeking warmth for digestion, coolness for rest, moisture for shedding, cannot thrive in a static, uniform environment. A 10-gallon tank with a single heat source provides none of the thermal variety this species depends on. It offers no behavioral options, no ability to thermoregulate, no natural rhythm. It offers only confinement. 3. The diagnosis. Back in the temporary setup, a systematic assessment began. The first measurement taken was substrate surface temperature on the warm side of the enclosure, the reading 82 degrees Fahrenheit. To most people, 82 degrees sounds warm, reasonable, even. But for a leopard gecko, the critical number is not ambient air temperature. It is belly heat, the temperature of the surface the animal is resting its ventral side against. Leopard geckos are ectotherms. They have no internal mechanism for generating body heat. Their entire metabolic function, digestion, immune response, reproductive cycling, cognitive activity, is driven by the temperature of what they are touching. For proper metabolic function, belly heat needs to fall consistently between 88 and 92 degrees Fahrenheit. The current setup was running 6 to 10 degrees below that minimum. At that temperature deficit, digestion slows. Appetite decreases. The immune system operates at reduced capacity. Over time, Chronic low-temperature exposure leads to a state of physiological suppression that can take weeks or months to reverse. The second finding was the complete absence of a humid hide. Leopard geckos shed their entire outer skin layer in one piece, a process called ecdysis, triggered by growth cycles and timed by environmental cues. Unlike snakes, which shed more predictably, gecko sheds are highly sensitive to ambient humidity. If the surrounding air is too dry and no moist retreat is available, the shed skin fails to separate cleanly. It stays attached, tightening around toes, constricting eye caps, cutting off circulation to extremities. Retained shed is one of the leading causes of toe loss and eye damage in captive leopard geckos. It is also almost entirely preventable, with one simple addition to any enclosure: a small enclosed space packed with damp sphagnum moss. This gecko had no such space. The third and most fundamental problem was enclosure size. A 10-gallon tank provides approximately 20 inches of horizontal floor space. For an animal that in the wild may patrol a home range of several hundred square feet, that spatial restriction is severe. There is no room to establish a temperature gradient, no space for behavioral variety, no territory to explore or patrol. Chronic confinement in undersized enclosures is well documented as a source of long-term psychological and physiological stress in reptiles. Stress hormones, when chronically elevated, suppress immune function, reduce appetite, impair reproduction, and shorten lifespan. The evidence was clear. This animal needed more than minor adjustments. It required a complete environmental reconstruction. 4. The plan. The decision was made quickly. A 40-gallon breeder tank would serve as the new enclosure, the minimum recommended size for a single adult leopard gecko and the industry standard among serious reptile keepers. Its dimensions, 36 inches long, 18 inches wide, 18 inches tall, provided enough horizontal space to establish 3 distinct environmental zones. Zone 1, the warm side. Surface temperatures maintained between 88 and 92 degrees Fahrenheit, powered by an under-tank heating element connected to a digital thermostat. A rock-style hide would anchor this zone, mimicking the sun-warmed stone outcroppings of the gecko's natural habitat. Zone 2, the cool side. Ambient temperatures between 72 and 78 degrees. A cork bark shelter would provide a shaded, private retreat for rest and thermoregulatory cooling. Zone 3, the humid hide. Positioned between the two temperature extremes to offer moderate warmth alongside high moisture, packed with damp sphagnum moss and sealed to retain humidity. This would serve as the gecko's primary shedding retreat. The substrate would be a naturalistic blend of topsoil, play sand, and excavator clay, a composition that closely mirrors the compacted, slightly sandy soil profile of the gecko's native region. This substrate supports light burrowing behavior, retains thermal energy, and creates a sensory environment far richer than bare paper toweling. Lighting would be provided by a combination UVB and LED fixture, running on a 12-hour day and night cycle. While leopard geckos have historically been considered non-dependent on UVB radiation, emerging research increasingly suggests that low-level UVB exposure supports natural vitamin D3 synthesis, improves calcium metabolism, and positively influences behavior and activity levels in ways that dietary supplementation alone cannot fully replicate. The centerpiece of the build would be a custom 3D, printed underground hide, a 2-chamber burrow structure designed to replicate the subterranean retreats leopard geckos occupy in the wild. Buried beneath the warm-side substrate with only the tunnel entrance visible at surface level, it would give the gecko a naturalistic option unavailable in virtually any standard captive setup. Construction would begin immediately. 5. The build. Day 1 of construction began with the foundation. The 40-gallon tank was cleaned thoroughly with a reptile-safe disinfectant solution, rinsed 3 times, and left to dry completely before any substrate was introduced. The integrity of the base environment matters as much as any individual element placed on top of it. Residual chemical traces, or biological contamination in an enclosure, can cause chronic low-level harm to a resident animal that may never be identified as environmental in origin. Once dry, the substrate layers went down in sequence. A 2-inch base layer of mixed topsoil and play sand was laid across the entire floor of the enclosure and lightly compacted. On the warm side, a layer of excavator clay was applied on top, sculpted into a gentle, naturalistic slope and allowed to begin curing. Excavator clay, when dry, forms a firm, workable surface that holds burrow shapes and surface textures without collapsing closely, mimicking the packed clay soils found throughout the leopard gecko's native range. The cool side received a softer substrate blend heavier in topsoil composition, intentionally designed to support the light digging behavior that leopard geckos exhibit when searching for cooler microhabitats. Allowing an animal to express natural digging behavior, even in a controlled captive environment, represents a meaningful form of behavioral enrichment that reduces stress and promotes psychological well-being. Both under-tank heating elements were positioned beneath the enclosure before the tank was placed on its stand, one centered beneath the warm zone, connected to a digital thermostat probe resting directly on the substrate surface above it. The thermostat was calibrated to cut power at 92 degrees and restore it at 88, maintaining a consistent belly heat range throughout every hour of every day without manual intervention. Thermostats in reptile keeping are not optional accessories. They are safety systems. An unregulated under-tank heater operating at full capacity can raise substrate surface temperatures to levels that cause thermal burns on a resting animal's ventral surface, injuries that are painful, slow to heal, and frequently fatal in severe cases. Every heating element in any reptile enclosure should be considered non-functional without thermostat control. Day 2 focused on hardscape and shelter architecture. The 3D, printed underground burrow hide was installed first, given its positioning requirements beneath the substrate surface. The structure, printed over 2 days in a terracotta-toned filament, consisted of a front entrance tunnel angling slightly downward into a larger rear resting chamber. One wall of the rear chamber was printed in a translucent filament section, allowing external observation of the gecko when it occupied the space. The hide was buried into the warm side substrate, with the tunnel entrance flush at surface level. From above, the enclosure showed only a narrow oval opening in the clay, indistinguishable, at first glance, from a natural burrow entrance. Beneath it, entirely hidden, sat a thermally stable chamber that would offer the gecko a level of security and environmental authenticity rare in captive reptile setups. The warm side surface hide was constructed from flat pieces of natural slate, layered and sealed along the edges with aquarium-grade silicone. Slate was chosen deliberately. Stone retains and slowly radiates thermal energy, a characteristic that makes it highly effective as a passive heat sink in warm zone hides. A gecko resting beneath a slate roof benefits from radiant warmth above and conducted belly heat below, creating a thermal environment more closely matched to the sun-warmed rock shelters of the wild. The cool side hide was a large curved section of natural cork bark propped against the interior glass and anchored with a small substrate berm at its base. Cork bark is an ideal reptile hardscape material, harvested sustainably from the bark of living cork oak trees. It is entirely non-toxic, naturally antimicrobial, and porous enough to hold slight moisture without degrading or harboring harmful bacteria under normal conditions. The humid hide was assembled from a ceramic bowl with a custom-cut entrance hole filled with a deep layer of damp sphagnum moss. Sphagnum moss was selected over alternatives, such as paper towels or cocoa fiber, for its superior moisture retention, natural antimicrobial properties, and the soft, yielding texture it provides for a gecko working through a shed. The moss would be checked and remoistened every 3 days, and replaced entirely every 2 weeks to prevent mold accumulation. Day 3 completed the habitat. 2 live plants were introduced into the enclosure, a Haworthia positioned on the warm side perimeter, and a small Sansevieria placed near the cool side wall. Both species are non-toxic to reptiles, tolerant of low humidity conditions, and capable of surviving the warm temperatures of the enclosure's upper zones. Their presence serves multiple functions, adding visual complexity that stimulates exploratory behavior, providing additional surface cover that reduces the open exposure anxiety common in prey species, and contributing modestly to microhumidity regulation through transpiration. A third plant, a high-quality artificial succulent, was positioned toward the rear cool corner, providing coverage without the care demands of a living specimen in a location that receives minimal light from the overhead fixture. Flat stone pieces were arranged near the warm hide, one angled to create a low climbing surface, one positioned flat as a smooth thermal platform adjacent to the heat zone. Additional corkbark pieces were scattered asymmetrically across the cool side, breaking up open sightlines and creating the layered, visually complex environment that reduces stress in naturally prey-vulnerable animals. The UVB and LED combination fixture was mounted to the top of the enclosure, angled so that the UVB spectrum covered approximately 60% of the warm to mid-zone, while the LED panel provided broad-spectrum illumination across the full enclosure length. Both were connected to a digital timer set to a 12-hour light cycle on at 7 in the morning, off at 7 in the evening, establishing a consistent circadian rhythm that would regulate the gecko's natural activity patterns, feeding behavior, and hormonal cycling. Temperature readings were taken at 11 points across the enclosure after 6 hours of operation. Warm side surface beneath the slate hide, 91 degrees Fahrenheit. Mid-enclosure surface, 84 degrees Fahrenheit. Cool side ambient, 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Humid hide interior, 81 degrees Fahrenheit with 62% relative humidity. Every zone was within its target range, the gradient was established, the environment was ready. 6. Introduction. The gecko was introduced to its new enclosure on the evening of the third day, deliberately timed to coincide with the dusk cycle, when leopard geckos in the wild naturally begin their period of peak activity. The overhead lights had shifted to their low evening setting. The enclosure held the quiet warmth of a day's accumulated heat. The substrate carried the faint, earthy scent of natural materials: topsoil, moss, cork. The gecko was placed gently at the cool side entrance. For 60 seconds, it remained completely motionless. A behavior well documented in reptiles encountering unfamiliar environments, a period of environmental scanning, sensory processing, and threat assessment conducted entirely through stillness. Then the tongue began to move. Rapid, rhythmic flicks, the gecko's Jacobson's organ gathering chemical information from the air, building a three-dimensional scent map of the new territory. One slow step forward, a pause. Another step. The gecko moved deliberately toward the corkbark hide, stopped at its entrance, turned once to survey the enclosure behind it, and disappeared inside. The introduction was complete. 7. The shed. 3 days after introduction, behavioral changes indicated an imminent shed cycle. The gecko became restless during its active evening hours, moving with more frequency than usual, rubbing its snout lightly against the corkbark surface, pressing close to the entrance of the humid hide without fully entering. These are recognized pre-shed behaviors in leopard geckos. The loosening outer skin layer creates a sensation that drives the animal to seek rough surfaces for purchase and humid environments for moisture absorption. Observation was maintained from a distance. Human interference during a shed cycle handling, repositioning, or even excessive ambient disturbance can interrupt the process and increase the likelihood of retained shed patches. The gecko was left entirely undisturbed. 4 hours after the behavioral indicators were first observed, the camera footage confirmed what had been anticipated. The gecko had entered the humid hide, worked systematically through its entire outer skin layer, and emerged from the hide with a clean, complete shed, one unbroken piece of translucent skin left behind in the moss. New scales, fully revealed, showed the species' characteristic pattern in sharp, vivid contrast. Pale yellow-gold ground coloring marked with irregular dark spots across the dorsal surface, fading to clean white along the ventral side. The gecko's eyes were clear. Its posture was upright and alert. It moved to the warm side slate platform, pressed its belly flat against the surface, and rested. That evening, presented with 3 gut-loaded crickets, the gecko ate for the first time since its arrival. 8. Transformation. In the weeks that followed, the changes were systematic and measurable. Activity levels increased steadily across each daily observation period. The gecko began utilizing all 3 enclosure zones, moving between the warm hide, the underground burrow, and the cool corkbark retreat across the course of each evening. It began exhibiting hunting behavior, tracking crickets across the substrate, stalking with deliberate, measured movement, striking with precision. Tail fat reserves, the clearest long-term indicator of nutritional adequacy in leopard geckos, began increasing visibly within 2 weeks of consistent feeding. The subtle eye dullness present at intake cleared entirely following the first successful shed. Perhaps most significantly, the gecko's response to human presence changed in observable ways. Where the animal had previously flattened and froze at any nearby movement, it began instead to approach the enclosure glass during feeding preparation, recognizing the behavioral sequence associated with food delivery and responding with active anticipation rather than defensive withdrawal. This shift from passive stress response to active, learned engagement represents one of the clearest behavioral markers of an animal, transitioning out of chronic low-level stress into a stable, enriched baseline state. It is not transformation in any dramatic, sudden sense. It is something quieter and more significant than that. It is an animal finding its equilibrium, discovering, one evening at a time, that its environment is predictable, its resources are reliable, and its instincts can be expressed without consequence. Millions of leopard geckos live in captivity across the world. A significant percentage of them live in conditions similar to those described at the beginning of this account, not through malice, but through a gap between what is commonly understood about this species and what the species actually requires. The biology of Eublepharus macularius is not complicated. Its needs are not extraordinary. What it requires, thermal gradients, moisture access, appropriate space, nutritional variety, and a degree of environmental authenticity, are simply the conditions under which it evolved to live. When those conditions are provided, the outcome is not miraculous. It is merely inevitable. An animal, given what it needs, will thrive. That is the most important thing this story has to say.